I'm so sorry I didn't bring my black armband today, but I must say that the quotation that you're presented with for this session does suggest that Canadians often lament that they have a compelling history, and I, of course, think otherwise. I think it's fascinating, riveting, and entirely relevant, including the social history part of it. And in recognizing the presence of the past in our lives, William Faulkner got it right in his comment about the southern United States. The past is never dead, it's not even past. How else do we explain without reference to historical experiences, Western alienation, for example, or our two solitudes? We just have to have that. Every person on the planet embodies, sometimes consciously, more often unconsciously, beliefs and assumptions based on an interpretation of the past. Moreover, we act on these beliefs and assumptions both individually and collectively. In some countries, wars are fought around long understandings of the past. Truth and reconciliation commissions are obligatory in situations where representations of history differ profoundly. And citizens of Japan, Germany, Russia, South Africa, for example, can attest that history books have to change when there's a regime change. Like all subjects of intellectual inquiry, history can be turned to good or ill. It is never a static truth. The absence of an ongoing critical perspective on the past leaves citizens prey to phony arguments manufactured by demagogues. There's reason to be suspicious when someone begins a comment with a phrase such as, "history proves that." As historian Eric Hobsbawm observes, history easily becomes the raw material of nationalistic or ethnic or fundamentalist ideologies, as poppies are the raw material of opium addiction. Reflecting on how history operates in our lives helps us to guard against such addictions. Now, a few intrepid souls, myself included, have tried to use a national framework for exploring the past. Believe me, writing the history of nations is no easy task. After I agreed in 1986 to be one of 4 authors of a 2-volume social history of Canada, my 3 co-authors squabbled among themselves about the framework of the chapters, and all of them eventually withdrew. It was much easier, they conceded, to write a historical monograph than a textbook. Having written my 6 chapters, I pressed on and fortunately found another foolhardy co-author in Alvin Finkel. We finally completed the job in 1992. Now going into its 6th edition, History of Canadian Peoples has been entirely recast several times, which is testimony to the creative side of history writing. I like to point out to my students that while historians are bound by the rule of evidence, how we frame that evidence is entirely a figment of our imaginations. Even identical twins would produce a different narrative based on the same documents. In later editions of our text, Alvin and I have devoted more space to political history and most recently to global trends, especially developments in the Atlantic world in the pre-Confederation period. The past is always written from the standpoint of the present and of the author. It cannot be otherwise. Now, if writing national history in 2 volumes is daunting, consider trying to compress Canadian history into 2,000 words. This was the task set for me by our speaker for the session, Peter Furtado, who is general editor, as you've just heard, of the History of Nations, which will appear next year. This man's resume is so impressive that I scarcely know where to start. For our purposes, it is important to be reminded that he was the editor of History Today from 1998 to 2008, making it more international in its focus and a must-read for general and academic audiences alike. His commitment to encouraging a better understanding of world history is reflected in 9 projects reaching back to 1975 in his role as editor for Mitchell Baisley Publishers, Hamlin Publishing Group, and Andromeda Oxford Limited. In 2009, he was awarded an honorary doctorate from Oxford Brookes University for his exceptional contribution to the promotion of history. He is one of our great public historians. He currently wears several hats as a freelance writer and editor, as co-founder of History FM Consultancy, and as a web strategy consultant with SIFT Group. In his spare time, he is involved in a variety of causes supported by the Society of Friends, a group that proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that a few determined people can change the course of history for the common good. And for 3 decades, he has been a student and teacher of Furtado, a Japanese martial art-derived body movement system designed specially to foster international understanding and world peace. How impressive is that? We are delighted, Dr. Furtado, that you agreed to travel across the pond to speak to us today. Please come to the podium.
I don't think I can live up to that billing. Thank you very much, Margaret. But I want to begin by saying that in January, it will be the 60th birthday of History Today magazine, which, as you've heard, I had the honor of editing for 10 years. And I'm delighted to discover that October this year is the 90th anniversary of the founding of Canada's history, or the Beaver, which is obviously our older brother. History magazines have a special role in exploring and shaping national histories. And in this field, I think we should all defer to the primacy of you Canadians. So, history and national identity. In AD 105, a eunuch at the imperial court of Han, China, reported a new technology to the emperor. It involved pounding bamboo and mulberry bark with water, then pouring the mixture onto old cloth or fishing nets. The fibers stuck to the cloth, and when pressed dry, they produced a quality writing surface. It was lightweight and simple to use. It's what we know as paper. Every Chinese schoolchild knows that the eunuch's name was Cai Lun. Also, we were told at the opening ceremony of the Beijing Olympics, where film director Zhang Yimou produced his spectacular choreography with 15,000 drilled participants. It was in part a history lesson, presenting the distinctive aspects of Chinese culture and its contributions to the world over the last 2,000 years and into the future. The meaning was spelled out by the broadcasters, who all earnestly read their briefing notes about Confucius's teachings, the Tang dynasty, or Zheng He's travels, not to mention Cai Lun and his invention. Surely this was the world's most lavish, largest history lesson ever. It was enjoyed by an audience of up to 4 billion people, though some who looked beyond the sheer spectacle perhaps expressed some skepticism about the messages of Chinese openness that were being presented. If the Olympics present a chance for the nation to present itself to the world, airbrush its past to contemporary messages and dress them in arresting imagery, then last winter you had the opportunity to follow suit. Please don't take this amiss. Thankfully, in my opinion, Vancouver made no attempt to match Beijing's grandiose claims for exceptional history or civilizing mission. Instead, you added something conspicuously missing there, a sense of humor. As an observer, I know which I preferred. Then in 2 years' time, it'll be our turn in Britain. How will London 2012 ceremony portray us? Will it be all about Stonehenge, or will it be the Spice Girls? I have to tell you, slightly sadly, a few clues suggest it's going to be the latter. But I suspect that there may also be images of Britain's historic genius for invention, whether constitutional, technological, and sporting, and for continuity through change. Our gifts to the world carefully modulated to celebrate tolerance and multiculturalism, shorn of awkward imperial overtones. I have no way of knowing how many of the 4 billion people who saw the Beijing display learned any history from it. But at least one person did, and that was me. In fact, I learned 2 things. First, I learned the bare facts of Cai Lun's life and the invention of paper. And second, and far more important, the fact, which seems obvious once you state it, that the things that the people in one country know and understand about their own past may be very different to the things that outsiders know and understand about it. And while I have no reason to doubt that every Chinese schoolchild indeed does know about Cai Lun, I am absolutely certain that every British schoolchild does not. I don't know about you in Canada. I know that if I asked a room full like this in Britain, they'd be very likely to get no hands put up if they've asked them who was Chai Lun and what did he do. Do I dare try here? How many people have heard of Chai Lun before today? Please raise your hand. 1, 2, excellent. I'm sure that's better than we would have achieved. The point about his story, and thousands of others like it, is that they are not only specific to the culture in which they're told, they are the very raw material of that specificity. I'm sure you can think of Canadian examples, and there are many British equivalents, say Newton and the apple, or James Watt and the kettle, maybe. Even more than language, these stories are the heart of what makes Britain British, China Chinese, or Canada Canadian. And the fact that Britons like me don't know the stories familiar to Chinese or Canadian people, or perhaps even vice versa, or if we do, our inability to understand them in the same way a native does, this is at the heart of our foreignness one to another. One of the most overused cliches about history, in Britain at least, is the opening line of L.P. Hartley's novel, The Go-Between. The past is a foreign country, they do things differently there. Do you all know that one? Okay. This points, of course, to the essential otherness of times past. Today, though, I'd like to reverse the proposition. A foreign country is the past. They know things differently there. The essential otherness of China, Canada, or Britain derives precisely from history, and not just from the history that happened, but the history that gets told. For every time choices are made as to what to remember, what to forget, what to mythologize, and what to revise, then that distinctiveness, of course, is being remolded. I mentioned my small insight about Chai Lun because it inspired my current project on global national histories that Mark mentioned. I've asked historians all over the globe to describe their own national story and what it means to their compatriots. It's hardly a scientific exercise, but as far as I know, it's the first attempt to do a public history study of this kind on a global scale. Rather ambitiously at the outset, I even hoped that by pinpointing our mutual incomprehensions, it would contribute just a little to the spread of international understanding. The first thing to say about it is how strange, how other I found many of the pictures being painted, even for countries whose histories I thought I knew reasonably well. I'd expected the literary form, the rhetoric, the language, the approach, the ideology to vary from country to country. What I could have anticipated, but didn't, was how essay after essay evoked a whole historical landscape that looked so strange to me. The past of these countries really was more foreign than I had imagined. My second surprise was how many places are truly troubled about their national past. I've heard that many Canadians feel that you don't have a clear national narrative. If so, then really, I can assure you, you're not alone. Even Italy, for example, despite recent controversies about the state stewardship of Pompeii as it seems to be falling down, it may seem a land comfortably steeped in history, yet the Italian national narrative is marinated in doubts and conflicts stemming from its origins in unresolved civil wars, the Risorgimento of the 1860s and the post-fascist years of the mid-40s, 1940s. Britain is confused, not least because the very concept Britain, though ancient, is completely ambiguous. When did British history begin? Was it in the Neolithic? Or was it with the Act of Union of 1707? The Czechs were faced with a similar problem. They decided they had to resolve it in a parliamentary debate. They had to vote on whether their year of origin was 935 with St. Wenceslas and the creation of Bohemia, or was it 1918 and the foundation of Czechoslovakia, or was it 1993 and the Velvet Divorce? They voted for 1918. The Russians, one thinks about Mother Russia, but even she turns out to have her genesis and her regular sustenance in interventions from beyond her borders. The Poles and Hungarians, proud and ancient people with polities blown hither and yon for centuries by European power politics, have narratives infused with skepticism and even despair. Others define themselves not by so much about what makes them unique, but what makes them as by what they are not. Thus, Irish, Scottish history is defined in large part by opposition to England. English history used to be defined in opposition to France. Perhaps Canadian history is defined in opposition to the United States. Other than the United States and perhaps China, not many countries have got a deep sense of manifest destiny, and authoritarian attempts to impose one, like Hitler did on Germany, tend not to stick. I suspect, for example, that Kim Jong-il's insistence that the Korean peninsula is and always has been the cradle and savior of all that is worthwhile in the world won't last either. Mention of these dictators reminds me of my third notable aspect. This is history written from a presentist perspective. We are not in L.P. Hartley's foreign country where the past is allowed to be itself. Thus, the doyen of Italian history, Giovanni Levi, wrote me a despairing account of what he sees his compatriots' long-established but troubled relation with his country's past, but is also a trenchant critique of Berlusconi's populist demagoguery. Russian attitudes towards their major themes in their past, the contribution of Western culture, the Tsarist era, and Stalinism, of course, they've all swung wildly as the political climate has changed over the last 25 years. I suspect national history can be seen in quasi-Braudelian terms. There's the longue durée, the physical environment, wind and water in the Netherlands, river and desert in Egypt, the cod and the beaver in Canada. Then there's the human, cultural, and political environment, which evolves slowly and often in recurring forms. The competing city-states of Italy, say, or the swamping of Aboriginal cultures by successive wave of immigrants, a very common theme you won't be surprised to know. But then there are national myths and legends which are often transmitted through the centuries in cultural forms far removed from formal education. And finally, les événements, the political events, particularly the events of the last century, which dominate debate and make the national story relevant to today. Whatever deeper structures are at play, there is no getting away from the present when looking at national history. When I was at school in the 1960s, E.H. Carr's book, The Uses of History, taught us about relevance in history. And last year, Margaret Macmillan broadened the topic into the uses and abuses of history. In national history, the past is always used and often abused. Evidently, the uses of history in a secure democracy like, say, Sweden will be very different to its uses in a religious dictatorship like Iran. And a country like Greece or Egypt with a spectacular heritage over thousands of years sees history in very different terms from one that's the product of the 19th and 20th centuries. Many young countries, including African nations, place more focus on a colonial and post-colonial national narrative than their more distant indigenous past. Of course, there are history wars over school textbooks on every continent, from the United States to Russia, Japan to Australia, as we'll hear later, as competing groups fight over the national story as it's taught to the next generation. It's hardly new, of course, to say that contests about the past contribute to tensions within and between nations. No one could be ignorant of the disputed historical perceptions of warring factions in, to mention just a few, the Balkans, India, Tibet, and of course Palestine over recent decades. In 2002, during his trial at The Hague, Slobodan Milosevic noisily argued about 19th century history with Stefan Mesic, the president of Croatia, repeating the very disputes that had fueled the fatal passions of the 90s. But we can't just deplore the abuses of history, we must understand how they came about. British historian Jeremy Black has written eloquently on what he calls the curse of history, the many ways in which the politics of the past and the present are fatally intertwined. It's a concept that's a powerful counterpoise to another of history's over-familiar commonplaces, George Santayana's dictum that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. In very general terms, I detect four broad, though not mutually exclusive, types of state and society, each of which uses its history in its own way. First, the liberal democracy. Here, history involves inquiry, reasoning, and a questioning of authority. Competing views are debated within a more or less open marketplace, and history often plays a skeptical role, offering a challenge to myths as they are asserted. As soon as one view becomes a new orthodoxy, it tends to get challenged by the next generation of revisionists. Second, the nationalist state. The intertwining of historiography and nationalism goes deep back into the 19th century, when many countries saw their first professional historical institutes established with a specific goal of researching the national identity and/or solidifying the national myth. Though the modern historical profession originated in such institutes, we would not always applaud the results of their work today. An extreme example was that of Turkey in the 1920s, where Ataturk personally worked with his academics to rewrite world history and Turkish history to make the Turkish people inventors, not only of agriculture and of metallurgy, but to have been the founding force behind Chinese, Indian, Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Mycenaean, Celtic, and German civilization. More often, though, nationalist historians have been happy to remain within the confines of their borders. Reasoned argument is not necessarily the primary mode, as the role is not one of challenging orthodoxy so much as validating it. This approach is still found in many younger countries seeking to establish their identity, for example, in the Central Asian countries of the former Soviet Union, but is found wherever nationalism is strong, in Japan, for example, or in India. Then, and related to the previous, is the ideological state. Here, history is the handmaiden of the party, the church, the mosque, or the leader, often seeking overblown associations between the present leadership and the glorious past. Think Saddam claiming to be a reincarnation of Nebuchadnezzar, or the former Shah reviving the Achaemenid Persian throne. Also think the Chinese revival of Confucius in recent years. Then fourth, there's the traumatized society, one that's been brought through huge pain and change in living memory, where history can be the tool of triumph, with the victors controlling what can be known, as Franco did for decades in Spain, or a tool of justice, reconciliation, remembering, or forgetting. Here's the Truth Commission, as in South Africa, Chile, or indeed Canada itself, sets out to be a form of history that allows the national story to move on. Controlled access to official records has been an issue from countries as diverse as Guatemala, East Germany, and China. In Northern Ireland, the search for justice and closure resulted in the most exhaustive historical study ever conducted, as far as I know, on the events of a single day. The inquiry into what took place in Derry on January 30th, 1972, took 12 years and £400 million to reach a historical truth dependable enough to lay the demons of what happened on Bloody Sunday. Alternatively, history can be used to construct a new narrative that contextualizes the recent conflict in Northern Ireland again, by showing that the divided communities had more in common than they realized, and by telling a new and bigger story of immigration and assimilation that reached back to the Stone Age and continues after the end of the Troubles. But of itself, history does not necessarily bring healing. Consider Japan, where the trauma and shame of 1945 left a lingering sense of victimhood and a continuing refusal to interrogate the country's behavior, and where the popular history of the 1930s and 40s is still most widely understood through Kobayashi Yorinoshi's manga history books, where Chinese soldiers are never less than heroes. In fact, my four different forms often exist uneasily within a single culture. But for us, in mainland Britain or Canada, which haven't suffered civil war, invasion, defeat, revolution, or tyranny for centuries, it's easy to forget that history can be a matter of life and death. We argue about it, of course, but in terms that are essentially polite. This wasn't the case in Romania, where Professor Ioan Ciulianu was murdered in 1991, allegedly for questioning his country's national myths. He is, I'm pleased to say, the only historian that I know of who has actually lost his life for his historical work. If anybody knows any other examples, I'd be pleased to learn them. It isn't the case also in India, where religious fundamentalists can trash academic institutes on account of the books published by their staff, as happened in Pune in 2004. But in many countries, challenging official historical truth can land you in prison. Asserting the historical truth of the Armenian massacre in Turkey, for example, could threaten even Nobel Prize winner like Orhan Pamuk with a 3-year jail sentence. And several European countries, Holocaust denial, which is of course a perversion of history, carries a prison term, as David Irving discovered in Austria. The wounds of the mid-20th century remain raw in many otherwise settled countries where issues of guilt and complicity still fester. One way and another, the pursuit of history can be a costly, if not a positively dangerous, activity. For my study, I asked each contributor 4 big questions. What's the basic story of your country's history as it's understood most widely by its people, but not necessarily as it's understood by its scholars? What themes recur and how do you see yourselves? Secondly, what are you most proud of as a nation about that history? Third, and more controversially, what do you most regret? Finally, what are the most common misconceptions that foreigners have about your country's history? These questions were intended to tease out how places see themselves and how they want others to see them. I asked not for a scholarly paper, but one written for a global, interested, non-academic audience. In Britain, we often use the stimulus of anniversaries to revisit our national narratives and traditions. We're in the middle of an extraordinary decade, 2005, 2007, 2010, 2012, 2014, 2015, twice, have major anniversaries coming up for us. Other countries use grand museum projects, I think France is a case in point, for the same purpose, or public commemoration and ceremonial, including sporting festivals. But it's worth considering who invents and passes on these traditions and why. There are a lot of possible candidates. These include officialdom and public authorities, like the minister we've just been hearing from, politicians, other public figures, pressure groups, historical researchers and academics, the media, filmmakers, writers, publishers, historical magazine editors, broadcasters. Then there's institutions that reach directly into people's lives, like churches and mosques, schools and school teachers, of course. And then there's the older generation within every family. Together, these groups form what I call the stakeholders of history, but their interests are distinct and they can conflict. I believe that for the most part, you are teachers and academic researchers, and your role is crucial, yet your vision of what history is and national history is and should be anyway, may well not be the main determinant as to what makes history history in Canada. I don't know about that, but certainly in Britain, the voices of groups other than educators and researchers dominate the public experience of history. The educators have admirable and sophisticated ideas as to what a historical education can deliver, but they don't get the time or the resources to achieve it properly. And sometimes, frankly, they can be reduced to bleating from the sidelines, deploring trends, interpretations, and enthusiasms over which they have little influence. Returning for a moment to my project, I've been struck by how unaware many people seem of how their history is viewed by others. In Britain, it's striking how few books on British history get published by non-Britons, even by Americans, Canadians, or Australians, let alone by non-Anglophones. I know they don't get written, they don't get seen in British bookshops. We have many distinguished scholars of the history of many other countries whose work is widely valued in those countries, but apparently we don't care much about what their historians think of us. And interestingly, not many of my contributors had much to say about whether they were understood or misunderstood by outsiders, except perhaps the French contributor Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie, who complained of Anglo-American misapprehensions about France, and the Israeli, who described how the popular enthusiasm for Israel on the liberal left in the early decades of the modern state has turned into the automatic mistrust that he perceives today. My question about regret led to similar thoughts. Some dealt with it comprehensively and straightforwardly. I wasn't surprised the German author had much to say on this subject. But several others not only failed to address the question as to what was most regretted in their country, they entirely omitted some glaringly obvious episodes. The Japanese author omitted everything that happened between 1937 and 1945, or at least August 1945 and the atom bomb. The Chinese author missed out the Maoist era. The American a Jefferson specialist skipped over slavery and the Civil War in one brief phrase. The Ghanaian altogether missed out the slave trade and the Ghanaian people's role both as victims and as collaborators with the slavers. I'm mentioning this not to criticize the contributors, all of whom had an appalling job, as Mark said, and who responded positively when I explained that these episodes were the very ones that readers overseas would most want to read about. But I did wonder why they weren't aware of this already. Did they feel a need to present themselves as a kind of ambassador or champion of their country and were reluctant to wash their national dirty linen in public? Or were they episodes that were just too dangerous to address? Perhaps that was so in the case of Mao, though the contributor did talk about the role of history through the years of communist rule, but surely not the others. The explanation, I suspect, is that when it comes to national history, we are just often unaware of what others think. Amazing as it may seem to us, the simple answer about Ghana is that the slave trade just doesn't form part of the school curriculum at all. In Japan, and despite the heated controversies about the coverage of controversial episodes in school textbooks, including the treatment of Korean comfort women and the horrors of Nanjing, it's said that in practice it's very rare for the school teachers ever to get as far as the Second World War in those textbooks. Now, even though those episodes have been written, it isn't studied in class at all. Mao, of course, was conspicuous by his absence in China's spectacular assertion of its new national story, Beijing 28. Instead, Chai Lun and the story of paper was presented as one of the historic 4 great inventions, the others being gunpowder, printing, and the compass, which modern China stresses as it claims its role of technocratic new superpower. Overall, what does this all add up to? 2 things, perhaps. First, that national history, however fraught, however contested, however irrational, really matters, even if we historians sometimes wish it didn't. And secondly, when it comes to national history, as in so many other aspects of life, it's hard to see the world through the eyes of others, and it's especially hard to see ourselves as others would see us. Thank you very much.